Kerbal Space Program is a game about the exploration of the vast wonders of space. So many beautiful places to explore, so many parts to play around with, the possibilities are endless. So, naturally, instead of doing any of that, I tried to sail around the Kerbal's homeworld of Kerbin as fast as possible. Here's the story of how that all went down. Our story begins in late 2021. I was a lonely, depressed college freshman, very much in need of something to do to keep my head above water. So, naturally, instead of doing things like making new friends, I turned to my favorite video game of all time, which is KSP, and its great community looking for mission ideas. At this point, I'd been playing the game for about 5 years, and had practically done every possible mission I could think of that wouldn't involve the use of a craft so ridiculously large that it would turn my CPU into a weapon of mass destruction. I browsed through the KSP forums until I came across a challenge called the Elcano Challenge, the basic premise of which is to drive a rover or sail a boat all the way around Kerbin or another celestial body within the game. I'd heard of this challenge before, but back then I thought it would be incredibly boring, but now that I was depressed and with nothing to do, I decided to take on the challenge. I'd already built plenty of rovers in KSP before, and as such, I decided to do a challenge with the most outlandish and oversized rover I could think of, and hence the Odyssey was born. It was a 40-meter long monster weighing in at over 50 tons, complete with a small interior, mining equipment, and even a small scout rover at the back end. I thought I'd done a pretty decent job making it and decided to test it out, and that's when I realized that it was a steaming heap of garbage, and not to mention, pretty ugly to begin with. It handled very poorly, the scout rover barely worked, and the mining equipment was completely pointless to begin with. It desperately needed a redesign. So later that night, after I'd gone to bed, I thought up new designs for a potential circumnavigation rover, and that's when I miraculously came up with the Odyssey 2, which featured a much more spacious, structured interior, service bay doors, and a much better scout rover, which I called the Mountaineer, which would be used to climb various mountains on any celestial body of my choice. It was also a much more compact design, being only 25 meters long as opposed to 40, and hence it had much better steering than the original. In addition, the useless mining equipment had been removed, and yet the mass of this beast still exceeded 70 tons. But it was functional, and I decided that would be good enough. Now, given that I had basically all the time in the world, and very little to actually do, I decided to take it to one of the most difficult destinations in the whole game, Tylo. And if you know anything about Tylo, you know that driving on it is not exactly ideal. Over the course of the next month or so, starting on October 17th, I would drive this monstrosity all the way around Jule's largest moon, through countless hills, plains, craters, mountain ranges, and valleys. I even visited both of Tylo's poles, as well as the cave Easter egg. It was an extremely large undertaking, taking easily over 60 hours of real-time driving, and yet I still loved every minute of it. Well, almost every minute. The mountains, not so much. Finally, on November 11th, at around 11 p.m., I completed the circumnavigation, and the sense of accomplishment that I felt when I finished it rivaled that of what I felt when I accomplished my first moon landing over 5 years earlier, which is a feeling I never thought I'd experience again playing KSP. To this day, I still regard it as my favorite mission I've ever done in this game. After completing this slog of a mission, I finally claimed my badge for completing the challenge, and yet I was still left wanting to do even more. So, a few weeks later, I began another Elcano run, this time on Duna. Then, once I finished Duna, I moved on to the moon. Then Val, Bob, Paul, Kerbin, Minmus, Ike, Drez, Elu, Moho, Eve, Gilly, and finally Lathe, which I didn't complete until late June of this year. I may talk more about these individually another time, but for now let's just focus on the Kerbin run. My first trip around Kerbin was nothing to scoff at, however. I was simply interested in completing the challenge at this point with no other set goal in mind. However, I would still need to design a new vehicle, seeing as Kerbin is covered by oceans that I would have to sail all the way across. And I would also need amphibious capability, however, as the oceans are not one contiguous body, but rather separated by a small land crossing about 45 degrees north of the equator. To tackle this challenge, I designed the Kelp, which is an acronym for Kerbin Elcano Propeller Boat, which, as its name suggests, was powered by propellers. Go figure. The boat functioned reasonably well and looked decent, but to put it mildly, it was slow, only achieving a top speed of about 52 meters per second on the water. Making it all the way around Kerbin took about 12 hours in real time, and that was even with 2 times time warp. But at the time, it got the job done. Following the successful mission, I then went on to use a very similar design for Eve and Lathe. Once I'd finished Lathe, however, I once again found myself looking for things to do in KSP. However, it was summertime by this point, and I was now working a full-time job, and as such, these types of things sort of just took a back seat in my head. That is, at least, until I noticed the trend on the Elcano Challenges forum page of trying to circumnavigate Kerbin as fast as possible. A user had just done a Kerbin circumnavigation in under 7 hours, and it had become apparent that the next major milestone would be a sub-6 hour run, or less than 1 Kerbin day. At that point, I decided I might as well try my hand at breaking that record, and, with some luck, make it around Kerbin in under 6 hours. After many failed iterations, I was able to come up with something that could go about 150 meters per second on the water, but that still fell well short of the 175 plus I'd need to do on Kerbin in order to complete a run in 6 hours or less, as that is the speed that Kerbin rotates at its equator. And so I kept on refining the design, switching out different parts and trying new setups, and some notable changes I made were dropping the idea of using solar panels entirely, which I initially wanted to do because I thought it would save a bunch of weight over using RCGs, but it just did not work at higher latitudes, and so it was not to be. I also replaced the advanced nose cones on the pontoons with tail connector A's, for example. Mind you, this was not a smooth path to success. For a while, it seemed like all I was able to do successfully was involuntarily test the durability of the KSP runway lights. Eventually, however, I was left with a vehicle that could reliably hit 180 meters per second on the water. I dubbed it the Kelp 182 Lightning after its top speed of about 182 meters per second, and after a few more final test runs and fiddling with the prop angles, of which the optimal angle turned out to be about 40 degrees, I began my circumnavigation attempt. The run began, as my previous one had, me leaving the KSC, heading directly east towards Peninsula. This is another reason I scrapped the solar panels, is that I would have had to go in the opposite direction in order for it to always be daytime at my location, which would have required very precise timing and speed, which I'm not sure would have worked with my situation. Initially, everything went according to plan, however, with the Kelp 182 screaming across the ocean and around the peninsula in about 30 minutes. After passing the first peninsula, which I had actually cut across last time, which funnily enough disqualified me from a complete sea circumnavigation, we began the journey northeast towards the first land crossing. Once I started heading north and night fell, however, I began to notice a problem. The Kelp was gradually losing speed the farther north I went. At the equator, it operated at a brisk 180 meters per second, but by the time I reached the 30-degree north mark, it was barely pulling 178. I found that this had to do with the density of the air increasing as the temperature decreases, as colder air means a higher air density, which overall means a lower blade RPM in my situation. This was highly problematic, as I had assumed that I would be gaining speed as I moved north instead of losing it, thanks to the fact that on my last run this is exactly what happened, because my blades were already able to operate at full RPM, and as such, they just gained speed, and they were able to keep going. Now, however, my sub-6 hour run was being put in jeopardy. Regardless of this, however, we pressed on, and a little bit over 2 hours into the run, I'd finally reached the first land crossing in almost 50 degrees north. At this point, the kelp was barely managing 174 meters per second, which is equal to the equatorial rotation speed of Kerbin. But with nothing else to do but continue, I continued until I reached the land crossing at dawn. Once I actually moved the kelp up onto land, I had to be very careful, however, as the front nose cones have an absolutely abysmal impact tolerance of 8 meters per second, which is definitely something to improve upon if I ever try doing this again. The emergence onto land was a bit suspenseful, but the kelp successfully made it onto dry land without getting a bloody nose. I'm sure that'll be the last time we'll have to worry about that problem. Foreshadowing, am I right? And about 2 seconds later, I'm reloading the save game because I smashed headfirst into a hill. Oh boy, yeah, the land crossing was not fun at all. I must have reloaded 36 times before I finally managed to do it successfully, and most of the fails could be attributed to the nose cone doing the exact same thing. So yeah, needless to say, this was very annoying, but it was something I had predicted, and yet decided not to do anything about because I feared that changing the design now would very much hinder my performance on water, which really turned out to be a remarkably stupid decision in hindsight now, didn't it? After about 30 minutes of painstakingly reloading over and over again, I finally made it onto the lake that would help me bypass most of the land crossing. Although the kelp can go up to 230 meters per second on land, as opposed to 180 in water, the extra speed really was not worth the hassle, and I'd have to slow down constantly anyways to avoid crashing. Once I was in the lake, however, it only took about 5 minutes to reach the other side, which was a refreshing break from the torment and pain on land. At least that is, until that refreshing break was rudely ended by the next part of my land crossing, which started with 2 steep hills. Getting over these 2 hills took an absurdly long time, and when I finally did it, I was actually pretty pleased to see that the land from there on out was almost completely flat, perfect for Jed's reckless drag racing at over 200 meters per second. Once I finally made it back into open water, I noticed that the boat was suddenly going a lot faster than it had been going before. In fact, it was going at a blistering pace of over 200 meters per second. I honestly have no idea why this happened, and frankly, I don't really care why it did, I'm just glad it did, as I was actually getting very worried by this point that I was not going to make the sub-6 hour run, or even break the previous record for that matter. If I had to guess, I'd say it probably had something to do with the buoyancy models in KSP, getting confused by the landing gears, but I really have no idea. From then on, it was smooth sailing, pun intended, back to the Kerbal Space Center. The kelp blazed through the high seas all the way past the Strait of Nydon, and towards the southern island chain west of the KSC. However, this is where I made my next mistake. Instead of going north of the island chain, which likely would have been much faster, I went south of it, as this is what I had done during my earlier Kerbin run. By the time I reached the bottom of the island chain at 57 degrees south latitude, it had become apparent that I made a big mistake. I now had less than 1 hour to make it back to the KSC, and still several hundred kilometers to go. For the first time, I had very serious doubts that I was even going to make it. And sadly, these doubts were not misplaced, as by the time I was back out in open ocean, I had under 15 minutes remaining, and Jeb went pedal to the metal, and the kelp gave it all it could possibly muster, but it was all futile. No matter what I did now, there was no way I was getting back to the KST before the 6 hours were up. The kelp screamed across the ocean at maximum speed, rocketing closer to the KST with every passing second. It was in sight, and before long we made it back onto the land and across the line. The final time of my run was a time of 6 hours, 7 minutes, and 38 seconds. We had failed to circumnavigate Kerbin in less than 1 day. I mostly attribute this to my route not being optimal, with there being multiple points for potential improvement, with the most obvious one being going north of the island chain rather than south of it like I had done, which probably cost me about 15 minutes. Jeb was devastated.